At just 8 years old, Jeremy Williams attended his local Cayucit Elementary School, along with his 4-year-old brother Daniel. They were members of the native Cayucit people. Their father also taught at the school in the isolated community on British Columbia's Vancouver Island. Belonging to a community steeped in tradition and rich in culture, Jeremy and Daniel were 2 of the 300 First Nation people living in the village. The rural, isolated community was situated 140 miles northwest of Victoria, surrounded by beautiful wilderness. Cayucit is the most northwesterly contemporary settlement of the Nootka-speaking natives. It is a fishing village. The food of the ocean has provided for the community for generations. The First Nations people came there over 4,000 years ago. They were drawn by the rich sea life, natural resources, mild climate, and the beautiful surroundings. But in those surroundings were hidden dangers. Wild animals lurked. Most turned away at the first sight of a human, but for others, they were bold and brazen. They posed a real risk, especially to those who wandered off alone. The close proximity of the school to the wilderness was a concern for parents. They had repeatedly asked school governors to erect a fence around the school and its grounds. They knew that wild animals were common in the area, and they believed that it was only a matter of time before an attack on the school children. Sadly, they were right. During the recent weeks, there had been more and more cougar sightings on Vancouver Island. The cats were naturally curious animals, and some had little fear of humans. They approached walkers, cyclists, and even wildlife rangers. The advice was always to stand still, wave your arms above your head, and shout. Never turn your back on a cougar and try and throw something at it. Any small children should be picked up. Typically, they will run away. Usually, they are just interested in something you're carrying rather than you, such as food in your backpack. But if they see you as the prey, then that is a whole different story. A mountain lion that is stalking you is not merely curious, they want a meal. On a Tuesday morning in May 1992, Jeremy was playing with his brother Daniel and their 2 friends in the school playground. Their father, who was one of the teachers at the school, was inside the building. He could hear the children playing and would sometimes look out through the windows and catch his 2 boys running around with the others. But he wasn't the only one watching the children playing that morning. A cougar had been drawn to the shrieks and cries of the young children as they played outside during recess. Jeremy sat down on a grassy bank on the edge of the playground, whilst the other children continued to run around behind him. He looked out at the surrounding woodland, but he failed to spot the camouflaged cat in the undergrowth. The cougar locked its eyes onto the small boy. It was a female, just a yearling. She was likely hunting on her own for one of the first times. Mountain lions typically remain with their mothers until between the ages of 14 to 21 months. As a yearling, she can't have been independent for very long. She was an inexperienced hunter, but an opportunistic one of the most dangerous of her kind. Cougars are hypercarnivores, meaning that they only eat meat. In Yellowstone National Park, they compete with wolves for elk and deer. Elsewhere, they also hunt smaller mammals such as raccoons, porcupines, and wild turkeys. But they typically hunt at night or during dusk and dawn. So why was this one out in the day? Perhaps it had had an unsuccessful night on the hunt. Perhaps it was very, very hungry. The cougar crouched down low, her belly inches from the ground. Slowly, she crept forwards in the undergrowth, her footsteps silent on the ground, her eyes unblinking. Then she made a dash for it, suddenly running from the woodland towards the boy. She covered the open ground between Jeremy and herself in a second. A flash of brown caught Jeremy's eye, and he looked up and screamed as he saw the 60-pound, 27-kilogram mountain lion launch itself at him. He didn't have time to get up and run. It jumped on top of him, instinctively going for the neck. Her claws dug into his body, and the long canines pierced his throat as it mauled him. The other children screamed and all made a run for the school building. Some rushed inside, shouting for help. They knew their friend was in serious trouble. It was pandemonium. Jeremy was trying to fight back, but he was too small in comparison to the wild cat. He didn't stand a chance. The weight of her body pinned him down, and when she closed her jaws around his throat, he had just seconds to live. Kevin Williams, Jeremy's father, heard the chaos outside and ran to the playground. There, he saw his eldest son underneath the beige-brown cat, his head in its jaws. He ran at the mountain lion, yelling and shouting, trying desperately to distract it and scare it away. He tried to find something to throw at it as he rushed forwards, but time was running out. Although only seconds passed, in reality, time seemed to stand still. The attack seemed to go on forever, with Kevin feeling powerless to stop it. Then the school janitor, also hearing the terrified screams of the school children, came running outside with his rifle. He lifted it, took aim, and fired a single shot. The cougar collapsed on the ground next to the youngster, but it was too late. It had already delivered its fatal bite. There was nothing Kevin could do for his son. He held the boy, limp in his arms, whilst his 4-year-old son, Daniel, Jeremy's younger brother, watched on. The death of one of their own shook the close-knit Cayuquit community. It was a tragedy that could so easily have been avoided. Richard Leo, a Cayuquit Indian chief, told the authorities that parents were furious at the school board for not protecting the children from the threat of wild animals. There weren't just cougars out there, there were bears and wolves. Richard said that no pupils would be returning to the school until they had assurances that a fence will be erected around its grounds. Being surrounded by prime cougar and bear habitat, their children needed to be kept safe. A dozen children were in the playground that day. They witnessed one of their friends being killed right before their eyes. And for Daniel, he had watched in horror as his older brother was mauled just feet from where he stood. Professional counseling was provided for those children, and there was an outpouring of support from the local community. It was a tragedy that will never be forgotten by those in Cayuquit. There are some 4,000 cougars in the whole of Canada, 3,500 of which are found in British Columbia. Vancouver Island has the highest concentration of cougars in the world, with around 800 calling the island home. In the past 100 years, 5 people have lost their lives to the mountain lions in British Columbia. Surprisingly, all but one of these occurred on Vancouver Island. During the same period, 29 non-fatal attacks occurred in British Columbia, 20 of which were on the island. The majority of these were on children under the age of 16. Although these attacks are devastating for all involved, they are actually exceedingly rare. But it is the elusiveness of the cougars that makes them so terrifying, knowing that they are out there and that they are born predators with the ability to take down a 600-pound moose. Most Canadians will never see one, but for those that do, it often comes along with their terrifying final affliction. John Barthe's Tiger Canyon Wildlife Farm sits in the Free State province of South Africa. South Africa has its fair share of big nature parks and wildlife reserves, but Tiger Canyon is different in a big way. Tigers don't naturally occur in Africa at all, but John Barthe, the acclaimed filmmaker and wildlife conservationist, opened the park to create a breeding program to combat China's dwindling Bengal tiger population. For years now, Barthe has played the biggest role outside of China in bringing the magnificent cats populations back to their former glory. But the farm doesn't just hold the imported tigers and their cubs. It's the place to visit if you want to see exotic cats. Lions, leopards, cheetahs, they've got it all. And just a few miles away is the Londolozi Game Reserve, an upscale resort that plays host to most of the tourists who come from all over the world to visit the best place to see all of the big cats in one place. But March 2017 was an unusually relaxed time for the staff at Tiger Canyon. They only had 2 groups of tourists consisting of about a dozen visitors altogether, and most of them were in their 20s and 30s. The 2 groups naturally got along with each other, as well as the staff members. It wasn't long before both the people who worked at the farm and the tourists had a few parties and barbecues together. It's not exactly encouraged to mingle too closely with the tourists, but South Africans are a friendly bunch, so it's easy to see how the outsider's visit went from business to pleasure so quickly. On Friday, March 24th, Tiger Canyon's manager, Jacob Peterse, took all of their visitors on a game drive to see the entire farm from top to bottom. During this time, his wife Sophie and their 3-year-old son prepared dinner for their guests. By late afternoon, the lot had returned and devoured the food set out for them. Jacob and Sophie left for the evening, leaving their guests in the care of a handful of staff members. But unbeknownst to them, the moment they left, the party started. Out in the wilderness with no one in earshot, the group lit a fire and got started on a party before it even got dark. By 10 that evening, almost all of their booze was finished, but not to worry, the South Africans who were partying with them had plenty of contacts who could sort them out in no time. A few phone calls later, one of the partying staff members took a walk to meet a taxi on the dirt road that led to Tiger Canyon. They exchanged cash with some booze, and the taxi driver drove away. But while walking back with the booze, he decided for some reason to stop behind the cheetah enclosures. Inside were 4 cheetahs held behind a metal fence. He needed to open a gate, walk through the enclosure toward another gate on the far side of the cage, and then he'd enter the area where the bungalows and reception buildings were. The people who worked at Tiger Canyon got along well with the usually dangerous animals. They'd been born in captivity, and even though they weren't exactly tame, they were very friendly with the people who fed and cared for them. They simply stared at the man walking through their home curiously from behind the bushes and trees. Cheetahs are some of the smallest of the big cat family, and they prefer to hunt small game. Even if they had been hungry, which they were not, the humans striding through the enclosure were a little too large for their usual tastes. That's not to say that they won't attack if they're especially hungry or when they're threatened, because they absolutely will. But the cheetahs knew the staff members fed them every morning and evening, and they had no interest in hurting them at all. But the staff member who'd walked through with his hands full of their beverages kicked the last gate closed behind him without latching it shut at all. As the party wore on until the early morning hours, that gate stood seemingly closed, but in truth it could swing open with even the slightest draft. When the music turned off and everyone went off to bed, everything became silent. Cheetahs are incredibly curious creatures, so it shouldn't be surprising that one of the 4 came nosing closer, its snout in the air, smelling the empty bottles and snacks that were left outside the bungalows. Before the sun came up, the cheetah was out on the grounds, scavenging the crumbs and whatever else was left behind. By 6 a.m. the sun was out, and the staff members, hungover and sour, started making their rounds. The escaped cheetah slunk back into some bushes when the movement around him became apparent. By the time that Jacob, Sophie, and their young son pulled into the parking lot, the evidence of the previous night's goings-on was already cleared, and no one noticed that one of the cheetahs was missing when they threw chunks of meat over their fence for breakfast. But now, up in a tree, the predator was watching silently and almost invisible as the people on the grounds made their rounds. It had missed breakfast, and its stomach was empty. It immediately spotted the toddler, and little Jacob was of a much more appropriate size for the cat to try for. At 7 a.m., Sophie headed into the kitchen to start preparing breakfast, and Jacob Sr. went out with his Jeep to feed the tigers on the other side of the park. The park stretched for hundreds of acres, and Jacob would be gone for the next few hours at least. Sophie left her son to play with his toy trucks and plastic animals like she normally would. Every cat in Tiger Canyon had dozens of acres, and every one of those enclosures was fenced and gated. They'd never had an animal escape, so the chances of little Jacob meeting a predator was almost non-existent. While she cooked and set the tables, Jacob played happily in the grass and sand. His back was turned to the trees where the cheetah was perched. Sophie was in the kitchen, and all of the staff were either cleaning up a bungalow or out feeding the lions, leopards, and tigers. The creature climbed down to take advantage of the opportunity, heading straight for the blond boy playing in the morning sun. Its padded paws made no noise as it stalked closer to the boy, its shoulders brought high and its head held low. Now it was out of the grass and in full view of the vast green lawn. If anyone had come by in those seconds, they'd have seen the animal immediately, but no one was there except little Jacob, singing nursery rhymes while he drove his truck on his hands and knees. Engrossed in his game and in his song, the boy had no inkling or warning of the thing that sprang on his back. The cheetah took a leap, folded its claws around Jacob's chest, and bore its fangs into his face. The boy screamed in terror and pain, pinned to the ground, helpless to run or fight. Jacob's attacker released its hold on Jacob's face and bit down again. This time, its aim was fatal, right between the ear and shoulder. The cheetah had Jacob by the neck. Blood spurted over its yellow-spotted fur, and it increased the force of its grip, cutting off all oxygen to Jacob's brain. Jacob's hysterical screams were cut off instantly when the animal took hold of his throat. By that time, everyone in the vicinity ran out to investigate the sound. Sophie immediately knew something was wrong when she heard her son's panicked yell. She ran from the kitchen, dropping a stack full of plates as she went. At the door, she saw the gruesome scene on the lawn. The cat was straddling her boy. There was blood everywhere. With an anguished wail, she ran even faster, but a gardener nearby was already streaking across the grass. He reached the boy first. With his bare hands, he grabbed the cheetah around the waist and lifted it into the air. The animal wasn't letting go without a fight. Jacob was hauled up with it for a moment, but his weight and the worker's yank ripped the nails and teeth right through his skin. The claws dragged across Jacob's small chest, leaving raw grooves behind, and the fangs tore his throat to shreds. Then Sophie was there, just as Jacob fell from the animal's grasp. She immediately grabbed him by the neck, trying to stem the torrents of blood that were streaming from her son's wounds. The man, strengthened by adrenaline, threw the 100-pound raging cheetah across the lawn. The cheetah yelped when it struck the ground. It bounded on its feet the moment it landed, streaking away, back into the cover of the wilderness. Jacob wasn't conscious, but he was still breathing, a horrid gurgling sound that sent bubbles of blood out from his mouth. Sophie managed to keep her hand steady for 20 minutes, not daring to move Jacob for fear that he'd bleed out if she lost her grip. Then the emergency helicopter arrived, landing right there on the lawn. Jacob Sr., still out in the field, saw the helicopter flying overhead and land around the place where his wife and son should have been. He jumped in his car, thinking one of the rowdy tourists had gotten into some sort of accident or another. But to his horror, he arrived in time to see his wife and the limp and bloodied body of his small son climbing into the aircraft. He didn't bother to see if anyone was all right. Jacob got right back in his truck and raced to the nearest town, the closest place that the helicopter would find a suitable hospital. When he arrived, his son was in surgery, and Sophie was in the waiting room where hospital staff had already given her a clean set of clothes. But it was too late. Jacob was brain dead long before they reached the hospital, though he remained stable and breathing for several days in his hospital bed. His parents had no choice but to take him off life support, to spare him and themselves the agony of seeing him die a slow and drawn-out death. Authorities decided that the attack was a result of human error, and the cheetah in question was recaptured and placed back in its enclosure. New spring lock bolts were placed on every gate in Tiger Canyon. The 4 staff members who'd been drinking with the tourists were all fired for their behavior, and the staff member who smuggled in the booze and left the gate open was charged with involuntary manslaughter. But given the fact that it was truly an accident, he never saw the inside of a prison cell. Jacob and Sophie Peterse never set foot on the grounds again. Working on the location where their son had been attacked was too much for them to bear. Even still, they will never forget the day that their son, 3-year-old Jacob Peterse, met his terrifying final affliction. As symbols of death and the devil, snakes have always been a particularly divisive animal and tend to have a drastically different effect on different people. Some hate them and squirm at the idea of being anywhere near one. whereas others love them so much that they want to keep them in their homes. It is estimated that over 160,000 snakes are currently kept as pets in Canadian homes, and with few regulations about the breeding of these animals, there can be issues regarding their behavior, which can result in tragedy. Regardless of personal opinion about the animal, it is generally agreed that snakes, especially very large ones, should be correctly enclosed and kept away from children. Unfortunately, this was not the case when Noah and Connor Barthe entered the home of a family friend who owned an exotic pet store, a home that they would never leave. When 6-year-old Connor and his 4-year-old brother Noah were invited to a sleepover next door at a friend's house to see the animals that were held in the home, they were very excited. Even at this young age, they were already very interested in animals, and the idea of being able to get closer to them than any zoo would ever allow made the invite even more enticing. The friend's father was Jean-Claude Savoie, and he owned the local exotic pet store. He loved being able to show off his collection to children, believing that the interest might stick and lead to a lifelong hobby. The boys regularly spent the night over at his house, as his son was close friends with the boy, and so Jean-Claude was seen as an extension of the family. He cared for the boys very much and considered them to be his other sons, so he would always make sure they were happy and well taken care of. They spent their day playing in the garden, interacting with goats, rabbits, cats, and dogs. They held the snakes and played in the empty tanks. To end the day, Jean-Claude took them out in his tractor, even letting them steer it, which they were delighted by. When they were finished, they cleaned themselves up and headed to bed around midnight. The brothers were set up in the living room on the sofa, while Jean-Claude and his son slept in their rooms. The boys were excited to be sleeping at their friend's house, and the idea that tomorrow they would be playing with even more animals made them barely able to sleep. Sadly, the boys would never wake again. Unbeknownst to anyone in the apartment, one of the exotic animals was planning an escape that night. In the room adjacent to where the young boys were sleeping, there was a 100-pound, 14-foot African rock python with an open vent above it. The species was illegal in Canada unless the owner had a specific license, which Jean-Claude did not have. But the man believed that it was a welcome addition to his collection, which he enjoyed showing off to people. The snake was not friendly, and at times was particularly aggressive towards humans, as it was a timid animal and would attack when scared. The animal had already attempted to escape earlier in the week through the vent, but it had gotten stuck, leading Jean-Claude to believe that the snake was too big to ever escape through the hole, and so it wouldn't need to be covered up or fixed. This was a decision that would cause the disastrous results of that night. The snake was hungry. It hadn't been fed in the last 24 hours, and so it was forced to try to find its own food. In its malnourished state, it was much smaller, which meant that it was now able to fit into the vent and found its way into the ventilation shaft. It slowly slithered through the shaft, moving from room to room as it tried to figure out where it could get its next meal. Although it was slim enough to fit through the shaft, its 100-pound weight began to take a toll on the ventilation shaft, and when it was making its way over the living room, it fell. Pythons will naturally constrict if they are in danger, and so, when the snake finally fell onto something, it grasped it tightly and continued to constrict. There was a smell of farm animals that filled the room, and so the snake concluded that the thing it had grabbed onto was a prey animal. Unfortunately, the snake was incorrect, and it had in fact fallen on top of the sleeping brothers. The smell was coming from them, as they had been playing on the farm all day, but the snake was not able to differentiate this. It could smell prey, and so it would treat the boys as it would any other prey. The boys initially tried to struggle, but were immediately overpowered. The snake was made of pure muscle, and the boys were no match for such prehistoric power. It began to constrict more, wrapping itself around the necks of the boys and biting mercilessly at the children's faces. As the children stopped struggling, The snake continued to bite and squeeze the children, either in an attempt to stabilize itself after the fall or because it was attempting to eat its prey. It is thought that the boys passed away quite quickly as the snake squeezed harder and gradually suffocated them. Although it would have been initially painful and terrifying for the children, we can only hope that it was over quickly and as painlessly as possible. Despite the speed of the attack, the snake did not try to consume the children and instead left them where it had killed them, their lifeless bodies giving the impression that they were peacefully sleeping. Jean-Claude woke up early and came into the living room at 6:30 a.m. He saw the children on the floor, and in the dim light, he could see their sleeping faces, and so continued into the kitchen quietly so that he wouldn't wake them. He accidentally made some noise in the kitchen and peeked out to check on the boys, expecting the sound to have woken them up, but they hadn't moved. This was unusual, and Jean-Claude started to have a bad feeling about the entire situation. He flicked on the lights to double-check when he saw the collapsed ceiling and debris across the floor. The boys still hadn't moved, so he initially worried that the debris had hurt the children, but then he saw his snake waiting in the corner. He looked at the animal and then at the boys and realized what had happened. The boys were blue. His snake had killed them. He ran out of the room to the boy's mother's house, banging on her door and shouting for her. "Oh my God, your kids are dead." Mandy heard the words echo through her hallway and her heart stopped. Her boyfriend ran from the house to check next door, and when he returned, his face was white. "It's true. It's a f***ing nightmare, but it's true." Mandy's world ended with those words. The tragedy hit the news worldwide, and thousands of people sent prayers to the family of the two young boys who were killed in such an unfortunate and graphic way. The snake was taken from the scene and euthanized by a vet who commented on how aggressive the animal was. Mandy began legal proceedings against Jean-Claude for criminal negligence, causing death, to avenge her children. But she knew that nothing would ever be good enough. She would never get her children back. During the case, they found that Jean-Claude had been warned by other reptile owners that he needed to cover the vent as soon as possible, as the snake would be able to escape. But he took his time to get it fixed, thinking that the animal was too large to fit through. What he didn't take into account is the amount that snakes can contract their muscles, especially when they haven't been fed. To convict the snake owner for criminal negligence, the court needed to answer 3 questions. 1. Did he fail in his duty as an adult to protect the children? 2. Did he show reckless disregard for their safety? 3. Did he fail to take appropriate measures to protect the children, causing their death? After 3 years of court proceedings, Jean-Claude Savoie was found not guilty and the case was dropped against him. Although their mother was disappointed with the result, it didn't matter to her. She would still have to continue life without her children, who at the hands of her friend met their terrifying final affliction.
Matt and Melissa Graves from Elkhorn, Nebraska, had decided to take their children on the holiday of a lifetime. After months of excitement building in the household, the vacation had finally arrived, and they headed to Florida in June 2016. Their destination? Disney World, Orlando. After experiencing some of the very best rides in the world, the family headed down to the relative quiet of the Seven Seas Lagoon one evening. Seven Seas was a man-made lagoon that offered boating and fishing experiences. There were a number of people walking along the shores, running on the beaches, and fishing from a couple of boats. Although it was late for the children, around 8:30 p.m., Matt and Melissa decided that it was their holidays, that they would stay up this once. On the shores of the lake, there was an outdoor movie experience for them to enjoy. It was something that they had never done before. Matt and Melissa sat and watched the movie, but as the children were so young, they weren't interested in what was on the big screen. Instead, they played on the beach, digging up the sand and splashing in the water. Matt and Melissa had packed with them a bucket and spade. They pulled them out of their bag and handed them to the children. 2-year-old Lane jumped up and down excitedly, toddling onto the sand that ran down to the edge of the lake. He grabbed the bucket from his older sister and began filling it up with sand. His parents helped him turn the bucket over, tap it 3 times, and then lift it up to reveal a sandcastle. Lane squealed in delight, and the family did this over and over. After some considerable time playing in the sand, Matt and Melissa decided that it was getting late and time to go. When they got up to leave, Lane cried out in defiance. His parents looked at each other. They decided to give in to their toddler's demands and stay a little longer. What harm could it do? When it came time to dig the trench around the mound of sandcastles, Lane picked up the bucket once more and ran to the lake. Wading into the ankle-deep water, Matt and Melissa watched on as he splashed into the shallows. He patted his feet up and down, looking down as his toes sank into the muddy, sandy substrate. Then, the 2-year-old bent over and scooped up a bucket of water to take back to the moat they were building. Suddenly, and without warning, there was a huge commotion. In an instant, their happy, playful toddler, who was giggling and grinning, was snatched by an alligator just feet from his family. Matt leapt up from the sand. He jumped onto the alligator, wrestling it into the water. The alligator had its jaws wrapped around Lane's head. Matt thrust his hand into the alligator's mouth. He tried desperately to pry them open, but the great beast thrashed around, throwing Matt off of its back. In the frantic commotion, Matt claims that another alligator went for him in a frenzied attack. It is unclear whether the minor injuries he suffered were from the alligator that took Lane or from a second one joining in on the attack. No sooner than it had happened, the alligator vanished, sinking beneath the water's surface. In a moment of shock and terror, the family were forced to watch their young son being dragged underwater by the terrifying 7-foot beast. In those first heart-stopping seconds, Matt and Melissa ran into the water where their boy had been dragged under. A lifeguard was alerted and came running to the scene. The water was murky and brown. Matt dived under the water again and again, scrambling about with his hands to feel for any sign of their son. He couldn't see a thing. He couldn't feel anything. Every time he reached out, all he did was grab fistfuls of the squelchy, muddy lake's bottom. As he came up for air, he saw Melissa frantically rushing through the shallows, screaming and yelling. Lane made for easy prey. He was only 37 inches tall and weighed 30 pounds. Standing defenseless in the shallows, he was an easy target. Alligators are ambush hunters. They are apex predators in their environment. They typically take fish, turtles, muskrats, birds, and deer. Unlike their crocodile cousins, they are typically less aggressive, and it is rare for them to attack humans. But when they do, they rely on the element of surprise and their bite force. The pressure from an alligator's bite is comparable in pressure to the weight of a small pickup truck. Onlookers at the lagoon could do nothing but watch in absolute horror, hoping upon hope that the boy would somehow resurface. But with each passing minute, their hopes were dashed. Emergency services arrived on the scene within minutes. Jumping into a boat, they scoured the lake. A massive search operation involving over 50 officers was initiated, and devastatingly, Orange County divers came across Lane the following afternoon, 17 hours after the attack. He was lying limp and lifeless in just 6 feet of water. Submerged, he had been left by the alligator only yards from where he had been taken. Heartbreakingly, he was just feet from where Matt and Melissa had frantically searched for him, but the muddy waters churned up by the commotion in the water made it impossible to see below the surface. Lane's body was pulled from the water, carried back to the beach and into the arms of his devastated mother. Rescuers pronounced him dead at the scene. Wildlife officers concluded that although Lane had suffered trauma to his head and neck, he had drowned when the alligator had dragged him into the water. There were only a couple of puncture wounds where the alligator had grabbed him. His body had been untouched after the attack. It is likely that the action of Matt jumping onto the alligator and attempting to free his son from its powerful grip had startled the predator, and after dragging the boy underwater, it had then let go. Lake Kissimmee near Orlando has the second biggest populations of alligators in Florida. It is home to almost 2,000. Their large numbers force some individuals to look elsewhere for food and territory to avoid competition. Some make it into recreational lakes frequented by locals and tourists alike. Following the devastating incident, officers captured and euthanized 6 alligators from the lagoon. When the alligators were examined, their stomachs were empty, suggesting that the reptiles inhabiting the Disney lagoon were hungry. The attack on Lane had been predatory. His actions had not provoked the alligator in any way. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Since June 2016, Disney World has erected warning signs along the edges of the lagoon, warning tourists of the presence of alligators. Although alligator attacks in Florida are rare, they They do occur, and they have devastating consequences. Lane was simply enjoying his vacation with the people who loved him most in the world. The alligator was simply taking advantage of an opportunity, one that resulted in Lane Graves' terrifying final affliction.
In August 2002, Rachel and Peterse Schwimmer took their 3 children for a holiday in the Catskill Mountains. They were from Brooklyn, New York, but always visited the Catskills for their vacation. It was something they did every year. They were staying in the village of Woodbridge in the Catskill Mountains. The heavily wooded, mountainous region is situated in the southeast of New York State. It is an area of outstanding natural beauty, a wilderness that stretches for 700 acres. The area is popular with hikers, cyclists, and water sports enthusiasts. In the winter, the Catskills also boast 5 downhill ski areas, which draw thousands of people to the slopes each year. Rachel and Peterse were staying with their 3 children in some summer cottages for their vacation. Those who lived in New York City often ventured to the Catskills to enjoy the fresh air and countryside that it offers. The area once attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Holiday cottages and hotels used to be popular and full to the brim with visitors, but now only a few holiday properties remained. Some of them were in need of refurbishment and looked run down. The young Schwimmer family had spent some time exploring the outdoors and were enjoying their time together. It was a glorious sunny August day. After lunch, their youngest child, Esther, was due a nap. She was 5 months old. Rachel decided to place the baby in the stroller and head outside the cottage. She and the 2 older children walked around the site quietly while Esther drifted off to sleep in the stroller. Once she was sound asleep, Rachel parked up the buggy just outside the porch of their cottage. Next to it was a large grassy lawn, which she and the older children played on whilst the baby slept. The older children were 4 and 2 years old and happily ran around on the grass, chasing each other and squealing in delight. Unknown to Rachel, there was a bear nearby. It was a young male black bear, probably only 2 years old or so. He was one that had become accustomed to people and frequented the holiday cottages. He was on the prowl for scraps of food. He often rooted around in the trash, eating people's leftovers before heading back into the woods. The bear lifted his head. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air. He walked purposefully towards the holiday cottages where Esther slept peacefully. Suddenly, there was a shout from one of the holiday makers. Rachel couldn't make sense of it at first. She stood up and looked around. Then the shout came again. "Bear!" Rachel saw a young male black bear come ambling out of the surrounding woodland. It headed straight for the grassy lawn and the family. Hurriedly, Rachel grabbed her 4-year-old and 2-year-old and ran to the cottage with them under her arms. She rushed inside and told them to stay there while she went back outside for the baby. But it was too late. She heard terrified screams and watched in horror as the black bear knocked Esther from her buggy. The screaming infant landed on the ground. Then, in one swift movement, the baby was lifted up in the bear's jaws. It shook her tiny body from side to side. The baby's screams were ear-piercing as she hung in the bear's mouth. Everyone came running out of their accommodations to see what all the commotion was. When they saw the dramatic and terrifying scene unfolding, they began running at the bear. They shouted and screamed at it to drop the baby. Reports suggest that Peterse, Esther's father, chased the bear. He was injured as the bear swiped at him, but he kept running at the bear, trying desperately to reach his baby girl. In a panic, the young male black bear ran into the woods, less than 20 yards away, with Esther still in his mouth. Several people, including Peterse, pursued it. They picked up rocks and stones and hurled them at the bear. At first, the bear stood its ground as the rocks came crashing down on it, hitting it on its back and face. But then, amongst the chaos of the screaming and shouting, the bear panicked and dropped the infant. Then it turned and ran off into the woods. Fallsburg police officer Dave Decker arrived within minutes of the incident. When he pulled up, he noticed the baby's stroller knocked over in the middle of the grass. He He followed the sound of shouts and screams into the nearby woodland. The infant lay on the ground, and Rachel ran up to her. She was bloodied, and her screams had died down. Rachel wrapped her in a blanket, and an ambulance was called. Tragically, on the way to Ellenville Hospital, Esther died from severe neck and head injuries. It had happened in a matter of seconds. Everyone was shocked and stunned. Panic began to spread through the people. Backup police officers who arrived on the scene shortly after Esther had been ambulanced off found the bear. It hadn't moved very far from the site and had climbed up a tree. The officers took aim and fired 5 shots at the bear. It fell to the ground with a heavy thump. The bear was taken away for an autopsy and to find out whether it was suffering from anything that could have altered its behavior. Woodbridge Mayor James Slater said that bear attacks in the area are very rare, and Ward Stone, the state's chief pathologist, said that in his 34 years on the job, he had never come across anything like it. That's why he was determined to find out whether the bear had a disease. Usually, the black bears in that region were very shy and ran away from humans. The only trouble they caused was from eating bird seed put out by locals and dog food. Encounters with people were few and far between. Rabies was ruled out, as were a number of other viruses. Inside the bear's stomach was woodland vegetation, as well as human food, small plastic bags, fruit labels, and aluminum foil. The bear had clearly become accustomed to feasting on human food and was attracted to the area because of it. The bear hadn't been tagged, which happens if a bear has caused problems before. He was a young male, weighing about 155 pounds, 70 kilograms. He likely hadn't long left his mother and was finding his feet in terms of foraging for food and securing territory. Wildlife experts tried examining the bear's brain to look for any abnormalities, but 2 of the officers' bullets struck the bear in the head, making that difficult. Experts say that he was probably attracted to the young family and, in particular, the baby, due to its unusual smell. Milk and diapers may have enticed the curious bear, and some suggest that he may not have intended to kill the baby. Prior to this attack, the last known fatality involving a bear in New York State was in 1987. This was an unusual incident, though, in which a young boy climbed into the polar bear enclosure at Prospect Park Zoo in Brooklyn. He was fatally mauled by 2 polar bears there. At the time of the attack in 2002, the American Bear Association said that only 40 deaths in the whole of North America were due to black bears. Esther had been incredibly unlucky. Following Esther's death, there were calls for bear hunting to be introduced in neighboring states, New Jersey and Connecticut. At the time of the fatality, bear hunting was illegal in these 2 states, and as a result, numbers of bears have been rising rapidly. This has led to more bear-human encounters and frequent complaints about bears wandering into residential areas and even people's homes. Feeding bears, intentionally or unintentionally, can lead to a dangerous situation where the bear becomes habituated to human presence and loses its natural fear of people. When bears become used to being fed by humans, they may start to associate people with food and become more likely to approach humans in search of a meal. This behavior can pose a serious risk to human safety, as bears can become aggressive if they feel threatened or if they perceive humans as a source of food. Once a bear has learned to associate people with food, it may continue to seek out human food sources, even if they are not being intentionally fed. This can create a dangerous situation for both humans and bears, as bears that have become habituated to humans may be more likely to attack. Situations like what happened to Esther Schwimmer can be drastically reduced, and people can enjoy nature without meeting their final affliction. We have a very recent and terribly sad case for you today. In late June of 2024, a 12-year-old girl went missing, and the collective efforts of a community is nothing short of amazing. Even in times of such intense sorrow and grief, The people banding together reminds us of how incredible mankind can be. The family has decided to keep the girl's name out of the news and have asked for privacy during this time. So, for now, we'll call her Mara. That name means sorrow and grief, and undoubtedly her family are drenched in the worst kind of grief, the sadness that can only come from losing a child. In the Northern Territory of Australia is a little town called Nunmariyanga. Most of the 360 people who live there are Indigenous Australians, and they have chosen to live somewhat removed from the more populated cities and towns. And with less than 400 people, you can only imagine how close everyone was. It's the kind of place where several households like to get together for dinner, preferring a communal feel to every aspect of life. And like we like to sit on our porches sipping on a cold beer at the end of the day to unwind, the town liked to get together after a long day too. But they preferred to head to Mungo Creek. There, the kids would cool off in the last remaining hint of Australian heat that hung on before the sun went down, and the grown-ups sat under the trees, sharing a cold one and passing snacks around. Mara and 12 other children ran ahead of the grown-ups, and they were already splashing and playing in the water by the time the adults arrived. As the late afternoon went on, the children went in and out of the water, and the adults sat and talked about everyday things and small-town gossip. At one point, only 3 teenagers were sitting waist-deep in the shallows, while Mara and her cousin were floating lazily about. The afternoon was about to wind down, and they were getting as much of those last moments of coolness before being told that they needed to pack up and go home. Mara was lying on her back, holding her breath to stay buoyant. Every time she let the air out, she'd sink almost until her face was submerged. Then she'd suck in another gulp of air just in time to get her buoyant again. She was so engrossed in the moment that she didn't realize just how far she was floating from her cousin and the others. At that moment, her cousin decided that it was time he got out of the water too, since Mara was no longer paying any attention to him. A few of the adults noticed her drifting off, but the children went several yards upstream all the time. The water was shallow, and it wasn't like the girl was out of sight. Even at the creek's end, where it met a larger river beyond the bend, the water was still gentle, and all of the town's residents knew that stretch of river like the back of their hands. The worst that could happen was that one of the teenagers would be told to swim out to get her attention when it came time to leave. But the creek had also been under the watchful eye of a saltwater crocodile, probably for several days already. The 14-foot beast couldn't overlook that this beach was frequented almost every day by humans at the same time every day, like clockwork. No different than when crocodiles wait for animals to arrive at a watering hole. The crocodile was waiting for one to break free from the pack, and Mara just happened to be the first one to do so. It followed Mara on the surface from below, gliding gently, its belly skimming the sandy bottom on the creek. When Mara came upon the bend, it waited just until she was out of the other human's sight before it made its move. Its approach was almost lazy. It simply rose up and surfaced right next to Mara's head. She didn't even see it, nor did she feel a disturbance in the water. When the thing sprang into action, there was no warning. Mara didn't even have a chance to scream. One moment she was floating, and the next an impossibly heavy tail with scales as hard as rocks slammed over her torso. It drove her into the depths, using only its weight and the element of surprise. Mara opened her mouth to shout for help, but she was already under the water, and all that happened was that her mouth was filled with mucky water. Before she could get a sense of up or down, or even what was happening, her frail little body was entirely encased in the beast's. Her arms were pinned to her sides, and she could feel the undulating serpentine body around her squeeze tighter and tighter around her chest. Her ribs began to crack one by one under the increasing pressure, driving shards of bone into her lungs. A combination of water and blood filled her chest, and Mara died from drowning in less than 2 minutes. No one heard a sound, even though they were less than 8 yards away from where Mara was dragged to the bottom of the creek. There she and her killer lay as the adults and the children began to call out to the now missing 12-year-old. The teenagers were sent out to fetch her, and they swam right over the place where Mara lay, still encased in the Croc's coils. When they returned to say that they couldn't find the girl, the group dispersed, walking a mile in each direction of the stream, getting more and more worried as the minutes ticked by. Before the hour was up, they'd called in to the nearest emergency service center, but that was a 7-hour drive away from the town, all the way in the city of Dundee. 7-hour drive or not, the first helicopter arrived in 3 hours, and by then all of the 360 residents of the town were swarming across the creek and the surrounding area. By the next morning, hundreds of people from the closest towns had arrived to help, and there was not a square meter of river or land that didn't have someone searching for the missing child. From the moment search and rescue arrived, they suspected that it was a saltwater crocodile. There hadn't been an attack in the area in 6 years, but the lack of screams or noise during the time that she disappeared left few alternatives. Only the mighty lizard could have done it so quickly and with so much stealth. 24 hours later, there were still no signs of Mara on the banks, and divers weren't finding anything either. The call was made that this was no longer a rescue mission, but a recovery operation. Chances of finding Mara alive were next to zero, and sure enough, 2 days after her disappearance, they finally found what was left of the little girl, hidden behind a crop of reeds that were growing a mile upstream. There were no crocodiles in sight, but people were stationed to keep a lookout in the area for when the predator returned to finish feeding. But given how little there was left of Mara, it was even possible that the animal was done with the body, because there really wasn't much left to recover by the time they found her. Authorities haven't released exactly what state the remains were in, but they were desperate to find the animal so that more remains could be retrieved, or else there would barely be anything to bury the child. But her remains at least did reveal the animal's estimated size, and they were certain that they were looking for a crocodile that was, at the very least, 12 feet long, if not more. Then, on the 7th of June, they found a specimen that fit the description that they were looking for, a 14-foot male, estimated to be at least 30 years old. They shot it where it was lying on a sandbank and performed the necropsy to confirm that it was indeed the beast that killed Mara. Her remaining body parts were added to the rest of them so that she could be buried as completely as possible. And now the surrounding communities are at a crossroads. On the one hand, the saltwater crocodiles hold a great deal of traditional significance to the indigenous people of Australia, but the Croc's rising populations are starting to reach alarming rates. Mara is not going to be the last victim if there aren't any steps taken to curb the thousands of scaled predators roaming the water of the Northern Territory. The people are split about their opinions. On the one hand, they respect and revere the creature, and have for centuries. But on the other hand, it had taken one of their own, and one of their youngest and most innocent members, no less. While people take a moment to absorb the shock of losing one so young, authorities have yet to come to a decision about what to do about the situation before it becomes an even bigger problem. If they don't, it won't be long before another unsuspecting swimmer meets their final affliction. The Siberian Zoo has had its fair share of tragic events in the past. It wasn't until the 2000s that the place finally got a much-needed overhaul. Most of the attacks were the result of untrained zookeepers and the unsafe and, quite frankly, bizarre setup of the cages. Most of the large animals, like the polar bears, black and brown bears, elephants, and tigers, are kept in low concrete holdings. Spectators can then view the animals from 10 feet above. The narrow railings that are in place are so wide that an adult can easily fit between the bars. Children have a habit of poking their heads through the railings to get a better look at the beasts below them. For the most part, mothers will keep a hold of their children, and adults won't be foolish enough to lean over too far. All in all, the zoo relies heavily on the fact that the animals are well fed, and therefore too full and lazy to even try to scale the high walls that separate them from the people above them. Just to reiterate, there is no safety glass, netting, or any kind of barrier between visitors and the animal below them. Just open air, height, and pure faith that parents will have their children by their sides at all times, and that irresponsible youths won't try to play daredevil. This terrible design flaw is the reason that the tragic events of our story today played out in September 1999. Yelena was taking her 3 children to the zoo that day. Her oldest daughter, Ivanka, had been looking forward to this day for months, but Yelena had always put it off, her excuse being that her twin boys were still too young. But now that they were walking and running around, she deeply regretted not taking them when the twins were still in strollers. Matvey and Ivan were a handful, but at least Ivanka was an observant and easy child, and she was an excellent big sister. At 8, Ivanka often kept her brothers occupied, while their mother cooked, cleaned, or whenever she had her hands full. The girl just adored her brothers, and she felt awfully important when she was tasked with keeping an eye on them. But even an unusually responsible and attentive child like Ivanka had more than enough to distract her from being her normal calm and well-mannered self in an exciting place like the Siberia Zoo, situated in the heart of Moscow. No one in the family had ever gone to any sort of animal park before, so even Yelena was a little awestruck at the sight of the hyenas, wolves, and polar bears that were on display. Yelena and Ivanka decided that they needed to make a return trip someday so that Dmitri, the family's patriarch, could also see the amazing sights with them, and hopefully the boys would be old enough to remember it then. Yelena assured Ivanka that in a year or two, when Daddy came along, there would probably be even more exotic animals for them to see than there were now. Right at the entrance was a petting zoo, and Ivanka took a short ride on a pony. The little family fed the goats and chickens, but they avoided the mean geese who chased Ivan and Matvey. Then came the African animals, ostriches, buffalo, a few different bucks, leopards, and cheetahs. The leopards and cheetahs weren't set up like the rest of the animals. These limber predators could climb just about anything, and the big cats, it seemed, were the only predators that ever attempted to scale the walls of their enclosures, so they were kept in cages or in concrete holdings that had netting spun over them. In front of the cats, there was always a handler or a security guard who kept the crowd a few feet away. The cats had a habit of reaching their claws through their bars, and they could easily snatch a person if they wandered too close. They looked at the wild boars and cages full of bright birds, and then they visited the reptile house. But Ivanka didn't like this at all. The little girl decided that snakes and scaly things were icky and gross. The place was also swelteringly hot. They were all dressed in puffy jackets, scarves, and gloves. It was just at the end of autumn, and winter was already taking hold, so the humid building that held the reptiles had them all sweating and flushed by the time they stepped out. The twins were not happy at all about leaving. They liked the lizards and snakes much more than their big sister did, and this was around the time that the boys became cranky and difficult. It was already noon, and by now they'd usually be down for a nap. The next stop was the monkeys and baboons, but even the apes started making a racket when the crying and screaming twin boys wailed past their holdings. After a stern look from one of the handlers, Yelena herded her children back the way they had come. Ivanka pouted. She knew that if the babies became difficult enough, their trip would be cut short. They'd already been through the whole grounds, and they'd technically seen every animal there. But Ivanka was hoping she'd be able to go past the elephants again. Sometimes the zookeepers allowed children to throw treats at the elephants, and maybe if they hung around long enough, she'd get a turn too. But the 15-minute walk proved to be too late. Just as they passed the elephants, a zookeeper came by with an empty bucket and the faces of some excited children behind him, all of them talking about how fun it was to pass down peanuts and fruits to the trunks reaching up below them. Ivanka was heartbroken. Yelena noticed the tears welling up in her daughter's eyes. There was a food stall in the last lane before they would reach the exit on their way out of the park. It was right before they'd reached the cheetahs, leopards, giraffes, and bears. She told Ivanka that she could have one last look while she bought the boys a snack. Surely food would give their sister at least a few minutes of peace for one last look around. And given that Ivanka was such a mild-mannered and well-behaved child, Elena had no reason to doubt that her daughter would be perfectly capable of taking care of herself for a few minutes. She sat the boys on one of the benches, and sure enough, the prospect of snacks and juice was more than enough to dry up their tantrums right on the spot. Ivanka practically bounced away like the capuchin monkeys they just saw when her mother gave her permission to have a quick look at the enclosures, with the command that Ivanka stayed within sight of her. But like all children, no matter how well behaved they are, it didn't take Ivanka long to get distracted from her promise to her mother. She got to feed the enormous giraffe and went for one last look at the lazy cheetah waving its tail as it lay on a rock. And just past the feline was the bear enclosure that held the black bear cubs. It was just around the corner, and it didn't occur to her that it was just far enough to be out of her mother's view. Ivanka hadn't gotten a good look at them before, and she still had a handful of pellets left over that the giraffe hadn't eaten from her hand. So she wandered over to the railing, expecting to see tiny, fuzzy cubs. But they weren't at all as cute and cuddly as she expected. The two larger bears were almost fully grown, and they were enormous. But she did spy some smaller, fuzzy cubs rolling around in a furiously cute game of wrestling. Ivanka sat right against the railings, looking down at the game playing out 8 feet below her. She was sitting next to an older boy who was leaning his whole upper body through the bars. He was yelling obnoxiously at the cubs, trying to get their attention. Ivanka thought he was very rude and loud. But luckily, a security guard stormed forward, grabbed the boy by the scruff and marched him over to his parents. The boy did attract the attention of the baby bears before he was dragged away, though, and they were curiously looking up at the spectators above them, searching for the source of the noise. But he'd also aggravated the two older males in the enclosure. No one had noticed it, but the boy had managed to throw a rock at one of them just moments before. That, combined with the constant noise and distraction of the long day, just aggravated the already hormonal teenage bears. They were pacing back and forth in their irritation. Ivanka leaned her head over the edge of the concrete to get a better look at the little bears below her, and she started throwing the snacks down to them one by one. To her delight, they just gobbled them right up, and she soon finished all of the pellets in her gloved hand. Once the food was gone, the animals lost interest and started seeking entertainment elsewhere. Ivanka leaned over even more, keeping them in her sights as long as possible. Just then, the spiteful child was back, yelling for the cubs to come back. Ivanka jumped when he suddenly screamed just above her head, but she wasn't the only one to be startled. The two larger bears also reacted, and as Ivanka looked up at the lad to tell him to keep quiet, the pair rushed at the wall. Ivanka, looking up, didn't see what the crowd did. One of the males stormed at the wall and stopped short, just below the boy growling at him. But the other one did not stop. With a surprising burst of speed for the 300-pound animal, it leaped up at the wall, its paws outstretched. The boy backed away so quickly that he tripped over his own feet and landed flat on his rump, right next to Ivanka, who was still on her knees, leaning halfway over the railing. The bear jumped high, but its head reached 2 feet below where the girl sat. It stretched out its body for maximum reach and swiped a paw in the direction of where the shouting had come from. The paw didn't manage to grab the boy, but it did snatch Ivanka, who was right next to him. And to the animal, it didn't matter. All the humans were noisy, hurtful, and needed to be eradicated. Its claws sank into Ivanka's cheek and neck, yanking her over the edge as the animal fell back down to the ground. She was so small and light that she practically flew between the bars, right into the midst of the maddened animals. The right side of her face was ripped open, exposing the teeth beneath her cheeks and leaving groves of raw flesh cut through her throat. She hit the ground on her left side at an angle, scraping that side of her skull clean. Ivanka's hair and scalp were embedded in the rock and concrete below the hysterically screaming crowd. Miraculously, the blow to her head did not kill her, but it did crack her skull, sufficiently dazing her enough to make her oblivious to her profusely bleeding face and neck. She even managed to push herself up with her arms and get to her feet. For a moment, she wondered vaguely where she was and why she couldn't see out of her left eye. She did not realize that it was a flap of her scalp that had fallen over her eye, obscuring her vision. But behind her, the bear was also on its feet, and it bounded around, searching for the human it had managed to get its claws into. With the same unbelievable speed, it charged. The crowd gave a collective gasp as the massive body slammed the girl off her feet, pinning her face down on the ground. Ivanka only knew that she'd hit the ground again. Completely bemused and barely conscious, she did not realize that the violent shaking and crushing weight on her back was from the beast on top of her, clawing through her winter jacket and sinking its teeth into the back of her head. It grabbed hold of her blonde hair and reared back, breaking Ivanka's neck as it yanked her backward. And so, before 8-year-old Ivanka could even comprehend what was going on, before the pain and the horror could sink in, her world winked out and turned black. The other male reached the bloody scene and joined in, grabbing the girl's lifeless arm. Even the littlest cubs were inching closer, thinking their bigger cage mates had food that they might share. Armed keepers and security guards stormed in, just as the second male streaked away, with a tiny hand sticking out of its mouth. The larger of the two was now thrashing the limp remains against the closest rock, completely mad with rage. Even the cubs shrank away from his explosive anger. It took 4 rounds of live ammunition to drop him. Even as it lay dying at the bottom of the enclosure, the animal never let go of Ivanka. The zookeepers had to pry her from its jaws after it finally died from a 5th shot in the head. Elena heard the commotion as she sat feeding her toddlers. Normally, she would have backed away from the crowd that was storming toward the bear enclosure just around the bend in the path, for fear of her young boys being hurt in the stampede. But there was a horrible sinking in her stomach. Ivanka should have been back by now. She told her to come back after 10 minutes. Where was she? But then she heard someone in the crowd screaming about a girl who fell in with the bears. Without waiting for confirmation, she grabbed up her sons and ran into the crowd, screaming for her daughter. When she finally pushed her way through the horde of people to reach the railings, she looked down and saw the pieces of purple fabric that had just moments before been worn by Ivanka. And around the corpse of a bear, men were carrying away the broken pieces of what was once a bright 8-year-old who only wanted to feed the fuzzy cubs. The zoo did deepen the viewing pits by several feet after that day, but the viewing areas are still open air for the public, and very little has been done to the wide railings. They also moved any carnivores and omnivores into cages, like the cats were held in. But this hasn't been nearly enough. Every year the zoo has a fatality or an attack on an onlooker or a staff member. And given the state that Russia is in now, it's unlikely that they'll implement any better precautions anytime soon. It's only a matter of time before another zoo-goer meets their terrifying final affliction.